Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Bio podcast. Today I'm joined with Professor Amy Jo Levine and Professor Marc Brettler. And today we're going to be discussing their upcoming new edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament. And with that being said, AJ Levine and Marc Brettler, thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you both. And yeah, so my first question is, can you both tell us what is different about y'all's upcoming new edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament compared to the older edition?
It's a very different edition, and it's a much longer edition. One of the main differences is that the translation that we had used in the previous two versions, the New Revised Standard Version, has been supplanted by something called the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. It's quite a mouthful, NRSV-UE, which has quite a few changes. And given that the bulk of the volume is an annotated Bible, if the Bible text itself is changed, then obviously we need to change a lot of the annotations. So we've done that, and of course have changed all the references to the Bible in the many essays. But for us, this really became an opportunity to think about what else we wanted to change. So we really insisted that all of the contributors look at their material carefully, and we sometimes gave them guidelines. They changed the material, to reflect the latest scholarship. And in addition to all of that, in many cases, and this is something that people had commented to, we would just give brief references to Second Temple or to rabbinic texts. So we filled them in so that people would not have to dig out 105 reference works to be able to understand what we're saying. Also, in some cases, we switched authors, both for the annotations and for the essays. And finally, as a result of some thinking together and comments from various people, we decided that we were missing essays. So we added a bunch of new essays. One of them, for example, is on stereotypes of the Old Testament versus the New Testament God. Another one is on Judas Iscariot, where we realized we talked about various people and the way from the New Testament and the way in which they're viewed in Judaism. And we did not have a section on Judas. And about another 5 new essays, which I guess, AJ, why don't you pick it up from here?
The new essays were suggested to us by readers who said, we would like more on something. And then Marc and I and the editors at Oxford, who were just saints in working with this, also made some suggestions. So, for example, we have an essay on disability and sickness, given the common stereotype that Jews looked at anybody who was disabled or ill or demon-possessed as impure and to be excluded, and Jesus invents healthcare. So we have addressed that. We have an essay on sin and atonement, because a lot of people were confused about, well, if Jews don't believe in Jesus, how do they get saved? And what's the view of soteriology? Given particular political situations, we have a specific essay on the land of Israel in Jewish and Christian thought, which includes questions about whether the New Testament pulls the covenant with Israel regarding the land, which it doesn't. But we've seen that in some Christian commentators. We have an essay on supersessionism. Does the New Testament, does the Christian tradition insist on something called replacement theology, where all the covenants with Israel simply, leave the Jews and go over to the predominantly Gentile Christian church? And why is this idea of supersessionism so common in Christian thought today, and what do we do with it? We have essays on Abraham. We have essays on Moses, because both of those are figures who were controversial in terms of what Jews say about them and what Christians say about them. So we've tried to address the general questions that could not be addressed in the short annotations, for which our readers were asking for additional commentary.
And I'll just add that in some cases, these new essays interlink. So, for example, Abraham is very important because of the promise of the land to Abraham. Moses is very important as the person who brought the ancient Israelites into the promised land according to the biblical tradition. So thus, those two essays link in important ways with a significant new essay on the importance of the land in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible as well.
Right. And for those people who are like Bible nerds, like I am, I don't want to speak for Marc here, but we have an essay on the Targums, the Aramaic translations and paraphrases of the scriptures of Israel, which are frequently cited in Christian commentary and some Jewish commentary as background to Jesus. But then we have the question of when do these texts date, and how helpful is it to look at some of these Aramaic commentaries in trying to determine what Jesus is thinking, as opposed to thinking about what 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century Jews are thinking.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, many of the essays are additional information, but we are both out there and hear what people think about Judaism in the New Testament. So the Targum essay is in many ways a corrective. It's a way of saying, you might think that this is incredibly important background material, but once you look at it more carefully, you realize the many levels of caution that you need to engage in before you say, you find a parallel between something in the Gospels and something in the Targum and find a significance to that.
Finally, I read a lot of sermons, pray for me, and I read a lot of lay Christian commentaries. And two of the places where we continue to find historical errors that sort of slide into anti-Semitism, not because the commentators and the sermon givers are anti-Semites, but because they're simply uninformed about contemporary research. And there's a sense of tone deafness here as they don't realize what they're saying. So we have a new essay on purity laws, and we have a new essay simply on Pharisees to complement the essay on Jewish movements at the time of Jesus. So we can get the corrections on purity and the corrections on Pharisees.
And what about the translation of the text? Has that been significantly altered or only altered on a minor scale compared to what's shown in the earlier edition?
Well, it depends in part upon the translator, right? So individual translators produce the drafts of each of the different texts. And in some cases, helpful corrections have been made. And in other cases, opportunities for correction that should have been made were not. And I think in some cases, problems were introduced where they were not necessary. So each text has its own annotations from our annotators explaining, in some cases, here's where the NRSV updated edition has improved, and here's where the NRSV updated edition has added potential problems, or at least sites for possible confusion.
And, I could guess that AJ was laughing for the same reason as I was. How do you judge how different a translation or how different a revision is? Because we all know that in certain cases, how you translate one word. So I'll give an example from the Hebrew Bible, from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Do you want to translate Alma as a young woman or as a virgin? Now, that might be the only difference in a trend between two different translations of the book of Isaiah. I'm being a little hypothetical here, but is that a big difference or is that a small difference? And there are many such cases where there are words here and there that are very significant, and interpretations have changed. And again, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse.
Let me give two examples, both having to do with Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish annotations. In the Gospel of Matthew, the first text in the New Testament, the word Jew, the Greek is Judaios, or Judaioi for plural, is not used very often, and it's usually put on the lips of Gentiles, like the Magi, the so-called wise men who actually aren't, come into Jerusalem and say, where's the one who is born King of the Jews? And it's a very odd question to ask the nominal King of the Jews, Herod the Great. Or the titulus on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So every time the word Judaios or Judaioi shows up in the Greek text, it is translated in the NRSV updated edition as Jews, except once. The very last use of the term is this kind of bizarre story where the Pharisees are wondering about what to say about the resurrection. And they concoct this ridiculous story about how money should be given to the guards, so the guards at the tomb will say, oh, we're sorry we fell asleep, which no Roman guard is going to say. In fact, no contemporary guard on duty is going to say, oh, sorry, my bad, I fell asleep. And while we were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body, which is also stupid, because if they were asleep, they wouldn't know what happened to it. And Matthew then says, this story has been told among the Judaioi until this day. Well, every other place where Judaioi shows up, it's Jews, except here, the translation is Judean. Why the shift? Is it designed to prevent some sort of anti-Semitism? Should the word Judaios be translated the same way each time it's used in a gospel text, as it is, for example, in the Gospel of John, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews? Or should it be shifted? That's one. And one opportunity that's missed is in the Epistle of James, where the author says if someone comes into your synagogue, and the Greek term is actually synagoge, it's synagogue, but the text reads assembly, as if somehow they can't imagine that synagogues would have Jesus believers among them. The term simply means a gathering place. However, in the book of Revelation, which twice mentions a synagogue of Satan, those who say they're Jews and are not, and they're probably not even Jews, they're probably Gentiles who are engaged in some sort of Jewish practice, what would be called Judaizing. Well, in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the synagogue of Satan, the NRSV UE has no problem using the word synagogue rather than assembly. And that's a place where a correction might have been more welcome.
And I'll also add in general that given the changing times, there's been a great deal more thought about Greek terms relating to possible sexual infractions. And there you'll see some changes between the NRSV and the NRSV updated edition. And finally, in terms of how the translation itself was produced, it is important to remember that certainly leading New Testament scholars were involved in the translation of each and every book. And there was a group that looked at the translation as a whole. But the ultimate decision in many cases was up to the National Council of Churches. So this does not always reflect in all places the original scholarly intention for how the Greek text should be translated.
Yeah. Hey, Marc, because you've been more involved in translation production than I have, in Bible production than I have, do you know if any Jews were involved in looking over the translations for the New Testament?
To the best of my knowledge, none were. I know that, I believe the idea had been suggested. I think it would have been a wonderful thing to happen, but it did not happen, as far as I know.
And what about the references to perhaps the manuscripts or variants in the text? Has there been updates to that as well?
I didn't check that closely, but the NRSV is actually pretty good about providing major variants. There are others that could always be introduced. Since we don't have any original copies of anything, we've got copies of copies of copies. And sometimes in working on translations, we'll use other languages that may have some sense of how we understand this word versus that word. This is always a guessing game as to which translation we're supposed to use. And indeed, people who produce academic versions of the Bible, whether it's academic versions of the Hebrew text with its little bit of Aramaic, or academic versions of the Hebrew, those are continually being updated as well. So the translators have a variety of editions of the Greek New Testament to look at, even to determine where their translations are going to go.
Yeah, your question is a good one. I know quite a few people who are involved in the new translation, and there really were two things. Up to now, we've mostly talked about keeping the same words in Greek, but as a result of either cultural norms, what words mean now in English as opposed to what they meant dozens of years ago, the translation, or our better understanding of the Greek, the translation has been changed. There are a small number of cases. I believe that proportionately, there are more of them in the Hebrew Bible than there are in the New Testament. This is as a result of more publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the text itself, that was the base text for the translation, has changed. So there are some cases like that in the New Testament, but again, proportionately, I believe more such cases in the Hebrew Bible.
I mean, just to give one example, which I think is helpful, the Greek word lepros, which is where we get leprosy, is used to describe people suffering from skin disease, the Hebrew bitzarat. And instead of reading leprosy now, the text, I think across the canon, now read skin disease or skin infection or something like that. And the word leprosy has basically been retired.
What are some of the most significant differences between this new edition and the older edition in terms of the translation work?
I mean, for that, you're probably better off talking to people who were involved directly in the translation work and the editing. What I saw, because and Marc and I both had to go through everything. So when we got a revised set of annotations coming in, we looked every single verse at the NRSV UE to make sure the updating was there, not only for the text, but also for texts that were cited. And there were not huge numbers of differences. There were not huge differences that caused the annotations to shift from one place to another. So some of it is cleaning up, some of it is correction, as with some of the statements regarding disability and so on. Marc also mentioned questions about how we translate certain terms regarding sexual behaviors or sexual orientations. But on the whole, I didn't find like a huge difference, like, oh my gosh, I have to toss my NRSV. I don't think that's quite the case.
And most of the differences are indeed in punctuation. I mean, punctuation matters. Right? One of the favorite examples I use with my class is the difference between let's eat, comma, grandma, and let's eat grandma, right? Those are two very different statements. But most of the punctuation differences are relatively small. But again, this reflects how important punctuation is, because it's really important to remember that all biblical texts, and here I'm including both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, lack punctuation. And how you decide to punctuate really does make a difference in terms of interpretation.
So when the book comes out and readers go through the new annotations, what sense do you both feel that readers will have when they see the differences between these annotations of the new edition versus the original?
I think on the whole, they're not going to notice. Because they're not going to have the NRSV in their mind so closely. And every once in a while, they'll probably look up and go, yeah, it might sound different. But it's because we're dealing basically with the same storyline, with the same plot. I don't think those words are going to matter to them that much. And for people who are not using the NRSV, but might be using the New International Version, and those would be probably more people on the more conservative side of the Christian spectrum, or people using the New American Bible, the Catholic translation, which is now coming up in a new translation as well. I suspect they're not going to notice huge amounts of differences. Marc, do you think the same thing would be true for people who shifted from Jewish Publication Society version to the new Jewish Publication Society version? Did they go, wow, that's different? Did they go, meh?
No, there's small differences. But back to Jacob's question, I think you were also asking about the annotations. So I hope people will see that the annotations are clearer, because we're on our third round, and I think we're better editors at this point. And again, as I said earlier, we have much more material that is filled in. So, for example, we realized it's not very helpful if we say to somebody, the Talmud Tractate Brachot 6a says something similar. So in many of those cases, we try to at least add a small snippet of what the rabbinic or the ancient text says. So I think the annotations are maybe a drop longer, but they're fuller in terms of the amount of information that they convey.
I mean, what I can say, because I wound up doing the annotations for the Gospel of Luke, and I changed a lot.
You changed a lot.
I did change a lot. And many of the changes were based on sermons that I've been reading since, I guess, 2015, when I started working on the 2017 edition. So, for example, there's a number of sermons for Christmas sermons, where pastors talk about, or priests talk about, the shepherds who come to visit baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph, the one to whom the angels got to sing in the heavens. They represent the unclean. And this is doing away with purity laws. So I have a little thing about, shepherds are no less in states of ritual purity than pretty much anybody else. So just adding some of those little notes, because we know where the sermons are going, to be able to prevent future sermons from introducing or inculcating anti-Jewish views.
And it's not only the sermons. I mean, both AJ and I are well aware of the fact that the last year and a half or so, there's been a dramatic increase of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic remarks, and we're even more super sensitive, if that's possible, to the way in which the text can be misconstrued. And we go out of our way to correct those incorrect interpretations.
Right, as were a number of our contributors. We changed out the essay on Christology. So the person who contributed this, we added in a number of Israeli scholars and a number of scholars in German context, like Austria and Germany. So the new essay on Christology talks about how do Jews understand things like Jesus is fully human and fully God? Or how do Jews understand the Trinity? And should these Christian proclamations be seen as strange worship of Avodah Zarah? Or, are they perfectly okay as long as you're not Jewish? Is this heresy, or is Christianity a way of spreading the message of the God of Israel to the globe? So, in a sense, we also have a more international sensibility, both in terms of the people who are contributing, but also in terms of how these texts have been read, not just simply in the industrialized West, but across the globe.
I want to go back to the Targums. Y'all mentioned the Targums a little bit earlier. Can y'all talk a little bit about how the Targums had influenced certain changes in y'all's new edition?
Besides adding an essay on the Targums, we've been very careful when we've cited the Targums in various... Targums are Aramaic translations and paraphrases of the Hebrew text. So that in our notes, we've been able to do cross-referencing to the article itself, so that if a note says you might find a similar statement in Targum something or other, then we can we can cross-reference and say, here's what that Targum is, here's when it dates, here's whether this reference is saying something about the authors of the New Testament and what they had in their toolbox, or here's how Jews, similar to Christians, might have interpreted the same phrase. So we're not so much looking for background information as looking at how do both Jews and Christians understand the texts that they share, and how might they have interpreted those texts or understood them, sometimes in dialogue and debate with each other, but very often working off of separate streams, but coming up to a very similar conclusion.
And the reason the Targums get so abused and why it's so confusing for so many people is we know from a variety of sources that when the Bible was read, probably even in the first century of the Common Era, it was read in Hebrew, and there was, in between various verses or at different points, it was translated into Aramaic. Because even at that point, Hebrew was not very well understood by all the people living in all the different parts of the land of Israel. So, fact, the Targum itself as a phenomenon did exist, or very likely existed, in the time of Jesus. But there also is a counterfact. We do not have any versions of the Targum from the time of Jesus. So the real danger becomes when you have a Targum from, let's say, the 5th century of the Common Era. Well, is it representing 5th century ideas, or is it accurately preserving ideas from 400 years earlier? We usually can't answer that particular question. Furthermore, something that has become clearer over probably the last half century or so in terms of Targum research is there is no such thing as the Targum. So to use the Hebrew plural, I'd say we have Targumim, or English Targums, and different translations, many of them quite possibly originally starting as spontaneous translations, were used in different settings in different places. So saying exactly which Aramaic translation might have been used in the 1st century of the Common Era is simply not possible.
Much the same thing as when we use rabbinic literature, which clearly postdates the New Testament. How much of it goes back to the late Second Temple period, and how much of it is reflective of its own time period when it was penned, whether in the early 3rd century or in the 5th century or even in the 7th century.
Now I'd like to ask about what y'all are doing about addressing the anti-Semitism going on contemporaneously. certain passages, like what we see in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, or a passage in Matthew, in which Jews are blamed for killing Jesus, or Matthew, in Matthew's case, it's the Jews are telling Pilate, the blood will be on us and our children forever. And so these passages like this were used to reinforce anti-Semitism, the notion that the Jews are responsible for Jesus' death. What are your all's thoughts on that?
These are issues that we looked at in the first edition and the second edition as well, and we've simply sharpened them up even more. So the comment in 1 Thessalonians 2, it's verse 14b to 16, where Paul talks about the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus and oppose all people, and God's wrath has come upon them at last. The Greek here is Judaioi, could have been translated Judeans, as if this were something specific to people living in the land of Israel, the areas around Jerusalem. Some people have argued that this is an interpolation, that Paul could not possibly have written this, Paul being a Jew himself, and he's so nice to the Jews in the Epistle to the Romans. So we flagged that as a possibility, but the annotator for 1 Thessalonians did not accept that. I think that's correct. I think these statements are original to Paul. So we flag them and say these are problems. We do not know exactly what Paul was talking about here. Christians should be aware that there are problematic statements in their own text. For Matthew chapter 27, verse 25, where all the people, the Greek is pasoleos. If this were written in Hebrew, it would have been kol ha'am. All the people cry out, crucify him, his blood be on us and on our children, which is a very odd thing for a crowd of people to say. So this is clearly coming from Matthew's pen. And various ways that the church has over time interpreted this, from the malevolent, the Jews are guilty of deicide, of killing God. We start seeing this in Melito of Sardis. And that's where this blood guilt stems from. Or on the more benevolent side, it's the Jews ironically calling Jesus for giving blood upon themselves and their descendants. So ironically, they're actually accepting Christian claims regarding the value of the crucifixion. So we note them all and say these are problematic texts and they must be addressed. But we have essays in the back, for example, on Jewish-Christian relations over the centuries, to which we can cross-reference to talk about how churches over time have dealt with some of these problems. So we've also put in our essays, and sometimes in the annotations, corrections made by, say, for example, the Roman Catholic Church, or various bishops' conferences, or various Protestant communions, so that Jews who are reading this text, as well as Christians, are aware that there are various Christian denominations and Christian gatherings that have taken note and attempted to address as kindly as possible the difficult materials in their own canon.
And one of the reasons both of us work together is that both of us are historical critical scholars, by which I mean our primary, not our only, but our primary interest is in what the text meant in its original or its earliest recoverable time period. And many of these comments, when you look at them in their original time period, for example, the Matthew comment might very well be connected to the fact that the text was written soon after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. And once it is contextualized in that way, and there the annotator does it does not quite mean the same thing as Jews need to be damned forever, or we need not suggest that that was the original intent of that particular text. And similarly, for example, when you talked about the added Pharisees essay, so the Pharisees often get a very bad rap in the New Testament. But one of the things that we talk about is who the Pharisees actually are. And we talk about different types of infighting between different Jewish groups at this particular time period, which is no different than the type of infighting that you have between different religious groups at any period in history. And therefore, we try to prevent the notion of that all Jews are Pharisees, all Jews are bad, by contextualizing this material within the historical debates that were happening in that particular time.
Right. And for us, there was a major conference in Rome in 2019 on the Pharisees. And that resulted in a book which has now been translated also into Italian and German. So we know a little bit more about the Pharisees than we did, say, 15 years ago. So we're able, in our new article on the Pharisees, written by a person who participated in that conference, to update the material that we already had.
And AJ is being modest in not mentioning that she co-edited the set of essays, the book on the Pharisees, along with Joseph Sievers.
And what about John chapter 8, verse 44, which has also been used to reinforce anti-Semitism, because some have interpreted this to suggest that Jesus that is calling Jews the sons of the devil.
Oh, children, right. It's gender inclusive.
Children.
Sure. And that verse has actually popped up recently, first by the Australian Bishops' Council, using it to talk about violence and evil. And then it got cited by Pope Francis with a bit of an international uproar, both from Jews who are familiar with the context of that quote, and from other Catholics who said this is really quite unfortunate. In neither quote does it say Jews are children of the devil. It just skirted around the reference to Jews and talked about children of the devil. So the citation was, in fact, to John 8:44 within context. So the annotations for the Gospel of John by Adele Reinhardt, who's quite an expert on the Gospel of John, already addressed this. And we have questions of what do we do with this type of rhetoric? Can it be explained, or should we simply look at it as this is just really difficult stuff? And for me, and for most of our annotators, when we have this difficult material, whether it's in Matthew or John or First Thessalonians, we don't try to excuse it. We don't try to come up with various explanations. The author only intended this particular group, because I don't think that's the case with the Gospel of John. To say there's really problematic stuff here. But Christian theology over the centuries, particularly following the Shoah after World War II, has changed because it's recognized the more dangerous text that it has. And many Christians are attempting to deal with it rather than to excuse it. And we think that's probably the best way of dealing with it. Here, the essay on supersessionism is particularly helpful.
And also it's helpful. We put a lot of attention into the introductions to each book, as did the annotators. And our introductions often cover issues which a typical introduction would not cover. So, for example, throughout all of the editions of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, Adele Reinhardt has a section in the introduction called John and Anti-Judaism. So we're also able to point readers back to that particular section, which offers a broader context and a broader understanding of that issue in John, which is a troubling one. And I'm very proud to say that we are in no way, I never felt that we were apologetic in the entire volume. Being apologetic is just not part of my being, and I don't think it's part of AJ's being either.
Yeah, that's not my strong suit. But what we also do along with this is we're not interested in inculcating guilt for our Christian readers. What we want to do is say, rather than feel guilty about this, because guilt really doesn't help very much, be aware of it. I think if we were doing this for texts in, say, Ezekiel or texts in Leviticus, we might also know, here are some very, very problematic texts which say horrible things about women or horrible things about people who engage in certain practices, and horrible things about Canaanites. Be aware of this. All texts have baggage, but that doesn't prevent us from correcting the problem. So rather than erasing it or taking a razor blade to certain passages, be aware of how they've been interpreted over time. And they've been interpreted differently. That business about you Jews are children of the devil, that's actually been interpreted quite differently over time. It's got 2,000 years worth of interpretation. Look at what we might do with this today. Because I think if we go back and acknowledge problems rather than blanket them over or apologize for them, we're in a better position to have more honest conversation.
What about the discussion of Pseudoepigrapha in the original Jewish Annotated New Testament? Has there been updates to that as well, like letters that were attributed to an author that were written by an author, like in the case with Paul, like 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, for instance? They were not written by Paul. So has Has annotations and commentary on those been updated as well?
We actually changed out some of the authors for the pastoral epistles, but we are very clear about what's probably not Paul, or what most biblical scholars outside of more conservative venues think is not Pauline, like the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, questions about 2nd Thessalonians, questions about Ephesians and Colossians, and all the notes are concerned about that. So we use terms like pseudoepigrapha or pseudonymous writings. We have encouraged our contributors not to use terms like forgeries, because that has such an insulting sense to it. And in each case, we've also noted that pseudepigraphy, writing under somebody else's name, is fairly common in antiquity, and we have other Jewish sources that do exactly the same thing. Isaiah, the prophet who lived in around 700 or so, did not write much of what is now considered the bulk of the prophet Isaiah. It was chapter 40 and up. When we have Daniel didn't write all of Daniel. It's not even clear that Daniel wrote any of Daniel.
Or who Daniel was, yeah.
Or who Daniel was. So in all of our endeavors in an academic environment, we tend to be straight up to say, we don't think that so-and-so actually wrote this. It's pretty clear for most New Testament scholars, by the way, that the Gospel of John chapter 21 was not written by the person who wrote, or the committee, whatever, who wrote the first 20 chapters, because chapter 20 ends with what looks like an ending, and then suddenly you have breakfast with Jesus by the seashore in 21. It's clearly an appendix. Marc chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, clearly an addition, and that's where we have like picking up snakes and drinking poison and so on. So we flag all that material, as would any credible academic annotator. In most cases, most of these editions do not have direct bearing on Jewish-Christian relations, but not everything that we've put in the annotations has direct bearing on Jewish-Christian relations. But we flag it and we say Jews are doing exactly the same thing. And we can see that through some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can see it in texts like 4th Ezra or 2nd Baruch, or the Assumption of Moses, and so on.
And in my final question, how about the discussion of interpolations in the Jewish Annotated New Testament? Has there been updates there as well? And how is the interpolation determined? Is it often determined by if something's missing from a manuscript that's in later manuscripts, for instance?
Sure. So an interpolation is, you have an original text and then somebody dropped in something else, whether it comes in from a copyist or a scribe. And how do you know what's original, and how do you know what was added in later? So we can look at the last several verses of the Gospel of Marc, or the last chapter in the Gospel of John, as interpolation. But generally, interpolation is you open up a text and then you close it with this new thing in there. So we were talking before about 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Some people argue that that's an interpolation. Why? Not because there's any manuscript evidence that would help us on this, but because it seems so antithetical to what Paul says about the Judaioi, about the Jews, his, as he puts it, his relatives, by biological relatives, in the epistle to the Romans. So if you have something that looks so different than what you have in another letter, maybe this is an interpolation. In other cases, you have a text that seems to float from text to text to text. So the manuscript evidence suggests that this text might not have been original. The best example here is the Gospel of John chapter 8, the story about the lady who was caught in the act of adultery. And this is where Jesus says, "The one without sin cast the first stone." We do point out, by the way, contrary to so many sermons, that when the people who are accusing this lady walk away, they're not dropping their stones, because they're not carrying any stones, because they're not about to execute this woman, because it's not a trial and they're also in the temple. It's a test case. Probably an interpolation. Other texts, for example, and this impinges more on the role of women in the church than it does about Jewish-Christian relations, is whether in First Corinthians, where Paul talks about how women should not teach or preach or have any authority over men, they're to be silent, even as the law says. There's no law saying they're supposed to be silent. Some people have argued that that's an interpolation. So how do you know? It's a lot of guesswork. Sometimes manuscripts will help, for example, with John 8. Sometimes it's a matter of this looked like it was added in later. And complicating all of this, particularly for Paul's letters, is some of those letters looks like the early church spliced together a bunch of different letters so that what we have in our New Testament is not what Paul actually sent to the people who received these letters. And you can see this very clearly, for example, in the epistle to the Philippians, where everything is going along perfectly well and fine. And suddenly Paul says, watch out for the dogs, watch out for those who mutilate the flesh. Well, that has something to do with Jewish-Christian relations. That looks like something that was spliced in. 2 Corinthians looks like it's got a bunch of splices in it, which also tells us, by the way, that even when we're talking about Paul, and we have updated our article on Paul in the back by Paula Fredrickson, fabulous article, that the Paul we have in the New Testament is not Paul. It's the Paul that the church decided to preserve. So what letters were missing? What letters were edited? What else might Paul have said? What would he have sounded like in person as opposed to what he sounds like in the epistolary format?
So to pick up on some of the things that AJ said, and then to summarize this point and to bring it together, there's now much more of a recognition that all biblical texts are highly curated. And that's not a value judgment. That is simply a fact of how ancient texts got put together. So I imagine part of the reason you're asking about interpolations is because many people think that interpolations are negative. That's a type of negative value judgment. That's not something that reflects the way in which we look at interpolations. Interpolations were notions that somebody thought were so important that they needed to insert those notions into a significant text and to give it a different authorial voice. So yeah, we do note interpolations, not as a value judgment, but because often we care about how people read texts. And often, if you keep all of the interpolations, then you'll have a very confused picture, for example, as AJ suggested before, of what Paul said, an amazingly inconsistent version of what Paul said. Sometimes you're reading a text and the text jumps in some way, and 5 verses later, the text seems to continue what you had a few verses earlier. So we'll talk about cases like that as interpolations. Again, not as a value judgment, but to help guide readers into what the text meant at different times and why there may be different bumps in the text.
At the same time, doing it with respect for our more conservative Christian readers, for whom arguments about pseudoepigraphy or interpolation are not helpful, because for them, the received text, usually in the King James translation, or for some, the New King James, that's the Bible. And it doesn't really matter whether Paul wrote it or somebody wrote it in Paul's name. If the text says it's written by Paul, for them, it's written by Paul. So we try in our annotations to be as sensitive as possible to the varieties of ways that Christians themselves read this text, because we realize we're working in somebody else's sacred scripture, and that requires the utmost respect, not only for the text, but also for their readers.
Well, thank you both, A.J. Levine and Marc Brettler, for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting us. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.